So thank you for the introduction and thank you for having me here. I'm really happy to talk a little bit on my perspective of transformation or the impact of digitalization on medical care, but also medical research. So I want to thank Axel Löwe and Sylvia for the invitation and for the chance to be here today. As you already heard, I'm a medical doctor. I'm cardiologist by training. So all I will tell you today is based on my opinion and my view. So this might be a little bit more the medical perspective. So I want to start with that I chose Health 4.0 in the title. And this is first, it's an analogy to Industry 4.0, but it's also possible to undermine this, that we do expect changes in our medical care. And this is an older paper, this is more than 50 years old, that described what is medical treatment, how do you think we think about medicine. And this describes as the primitive epoch where we believe that external things like planets, like if you have a blizzard in your nearby, that this might lead to disease. Then we had the system, like the Hippocrates system, where we started to think about that immanent aspects influence diseases. So this was the first aspect and therefore the first revolution regarding a modern medicine. Then the same as in techniques in physics during the Enlightenment period, this was the start of modern scientific driven medicine. Then with industrialization, we saw that not only the individual aspect is of importance, but that sometimes the overall goal for a country or whatsoever might be above the individual. So this was some sort of a third revolution, and that now with technology, this might further impact or change or transform or even disrupt medical care. And this is what we at the moment are currently. So we do have different stakeholders in medicine. These are established, these are regulated stakeholders with clearly defined interaction paths. So we have like patients, we have the medical professionals, we have the authorities. So this is current status. And if we now introduce technology, which could be named like Health 4.0, that this technology is not part of the current situation. So technology interacts with each stakeholder on its own. So it's quite, and this might be the aspect that leads to disruption, as a lot of paths that we have established over the last hundreds of years might not be true anymore. So, and this is, I said that it will always be my perspective. So I thought, okay, I'm a cardiologist. I'm a strong interest in acute cardiac care. So if I think about use cases and what are requirements for a medical doctor on one hand, and what could be use case or is a use case for technology, I used a setting that is familiar for me. So like acute emergency care for a cardiologist, myocardial infarction is our central diagnosis, or maybe not but one important diagnosis for a cardiologist. So this is something that happens in an acute state on the streets. And therefore, I wanted to start this. So this starts with patient level, then goes to, these are like paramedics or ambulance on the street. Then we have the next step, and all here is clinical orientated. So I actually do not have examples for outpatient care. Then the next step would be the emergency department, the entry port to the hospital, and finally the regular ward. So what do we expect? So if you think about, and if we ask, for example, large language models, what could be expected, then that we might provide expert knowledge in the broad range via AI technologies, that we might help regarding data acquisition and data management, and that finally also decision support systems might be helpful. Okay, so I now want to go back to my use case chain and want to start with this aspect, patient level data. And what could be of interest regarding patient-level data. And this is the first step, is that we have to identify that there might be a state of emergency, that there might be a diagnosis of relevance that needs medical attention. And with the introduction of, for example, wearables or smartwatches, which is now maybe 10 years ago, in the beginning, we had often case reports that such wearables like smartwatches might help patients without contacting medical professionals to identify a potential diagnosis. So this could be of interest and might be a good use case. My next slide is now one of the large studies and large data sets, which is the Apple Heart study. And I'm aware that this is a highly discussed and debated study. So this is, I think, one of the first really large publications out of the Apple Heart study. This was published in 2019, I think, in the New England Journal of Medicine.
I just wanted to click the OK.
No, I can start over. So the Apple Heart study, which the idea was that via smartwatch, patients will be identified and notified that they have an irregular pulse, and this will be followed up to see if it's actually arrhythmia. And the interesting thing is that, so this is a large data set. So it's more than 400,000 individuals that took part in this study. And on the left down side, this is the amount of notifications in percentage. And what we see is that the amount is still low. So the number of the ones that were notified is between 2 and 3% only. So you need a large number of patients that actually have the device. There you generate a rather small number of notifications. And the results were that out of these notifications, only about 30% actually had arrhythmias. So the problem is something with specificity and sensitivity. So we do see, we generate a lot of work, but we are not that specific. So 70% did not have anything, but still they have to go to a medical doctor and generate work for the medical system that might not be needed. So this shows the strengths and limitations of if you generate large-scale data on patient level, we have the chance to identify much earlier relevant diagnosis, but we might generate a lot of false positives. Okay, going to patient level, next step, rapid response. So if I have the feeling I have a myocardial infarction, I call an emergency setting, then the paramedics have to dispatch and went there. And this takes time. And this is something where technology like social networking or swarm systems come into play. And this works quite well. So there are some networks where you can register as first responder. So if you're trained and you want to do this, you will be registered within one network, and you will be notified based on geolocation if there's something nearby. And this is a small German study that actually showed that the time between notification of the rescue chain and arrival is reduced. So this seems to be a really good idea. And this led to a huge amount of different structures and networks for these first responders. So this is a German map, and all that is not gray are regions that do have such first responder systems already. Okay, going back, patient level. Now to the ambulance level. And what we there have and what might have is of great interest is that we have a lot of information, and it's all time critical. So I have to focus on the patient and I have to deal with the data. So aspects that are evaluated and are from a medical standpoint of great interest is help in documentation and help in interpretation of large data sets in real time. And this is data from Sweden where they established, this is without AI, just establishing a digital system for gathering information out on the streets for a structured data set. And what this graph shows is that after implementation of such technologies, the completeness of the data set improved. So the more and more complete data you have, the better you can make decisions. So this is the first step that says, okay, it's a good idea to not write it on paper, but to have it ready, available, and documented. The next step is that there are already studies that try to automatize these documentation, and that this, on one hand, works from a technical standpoint, and that the second point is that what does it improve? And in this study, it helps to need less time for documentation. This is the upper point, temporal demand. And the second point, I think this is the most important, that it reduces frustration level if you do not have to document all by your own. So this is really a good idea to improve patient care out on the streets and to be faster. And this last thing that I wanted to show is this real-time information. So this is a stress situation. You are in an emergency car, you have a potentially severe sick patient, and you get a lot of real-time information. And that monitoring this real-time information might help to focus on things that really have to be treated or taken care of. And this is an older study that showed that if you automatically monitor such variables, that it might be helpful to earlier identify, in this case, hemodynamic instability. So this is all, let's say, more on a theoretical standpoint. And to sum up a little bit this emergency care on the street aspect, this is a study that was recently published that actually did a trial where they implemented such digital systems, including real-time patient information exchange between emergency car and hospital, also having real-time exchange with the organization, like which hospital has a free bed, to which hospital the patient should drive. This was done in Korea. It's a quite large cohort. If you look on what they generated as dashboards, this looks a little bit more like a logistics company than emergency care, but they provide a lot of real-time information. And the problem is that even if you have a good technology and have a good idea how to implement it, it might not improve. So these are the results. So it's more than 16,000 transportations that went into the study. On the right, these are the results. And so what we see is that the transport time they were not able to reduce the transport time or the transfer time. Actually, it's significant longer, but 10 to 9 minutes. Also, if you look down on the mortality rate, so do you improve care? There might be a trend towards lower mortality, but this was even in this study not significant. What they then did, they looked into specific groups that face transfer challenges, like specific diagnosis, and in those, they found benefit of these systems. So bottom line is that especially if you have already a very good system, like without the digital system, they also have only 9 minutes. So this is extremely good. And if you have a good system, then it's hard to get it better, and it's often only helpful in specific cases and not in the general. This is not, don't do it, it's just not everything will improve. Okay, so now changing from out on the streets to door of the hospital or emergency department. So if you think about emergency departments, and this is something that is in Germany as well in nearly all Western countries, but also worldwide, that we have always the risk of overcrowding. So we have a huge amount of patients that come into the emergency department. We do have high-risk patients where it's crucial to be timely and to initiate adequate therapy. So you have, on one hand, a large amount that could just go home, and you have to identify those that need urgent treatment. And what is the current status or state of the art? Well, yeah, here, this is what I meant with triage. And triage is the current state of the art. So normally you have a trained medical professional, like an ED nurse, that does a quick classification on risk. And based on this risk, you have standard operating procedures. They say, okay, if you are in an orange or red group, then this patient has to be seen by a medical doctor within 10 minutes or something like that. So this defines paths within. This is done by humans that are trained. And this might be a good use case for implementation of technology. And this is something that others have thought also. So this is a study that just did this. So this uses, let's say, more traditional machine learning based on variables that were acquired during the outpatient phase and during the ED. And based on this, on an AI algorithm, it generates this classification, like high risk and so on. And it also has a field for explanation. Why in this patient was he or she classified as high or intermediate risk? And this works quite well. So these are the results. And I just want to focus on the first one. These are critical care patients, which would also include cardiac patients with high acuity. And what we see is they had a two-step approach in the study. So they had patients where only the trained nurse does the classification. Then they did the AI, and then the nurse was also able to improve based on nurse plus AI. And what we see is that if you look just on sensitivity and specificity, in these patients, that the AI performs comparable to the nurse. And that sometimes there is a little bit benefit if you combine it, but still this shows that AI-driven classification might work. And this is based on, actually, they use random forest models based on in-house available data for this models. And with the, everyone talks about large language models, there has to be also a study that uses large language models that does this classification. This is also quite recently published. And this is the performance comparing the physician and the large language model for classification of acuity in an emergency department. And this also works quite well. So overall, the LLM even outperforms the human. In specific cases, the human might be better. This just shows that technology there might really help, especially if you think about overcrowded IDs and a lot of work where we have to identify those that need treatment. So we see the technology works, but if I go back to the second slide in my talk, that if we enter new technology, we disrupt established paths. And this might lead to issues with trust. And if we think about acute cardiac care or acute emergency care, the trust in decisions and the trust in the medical treatment is a really important aspect. And we see that studies show it does work. And there are now some smaller studies that use surveys to show, okay, what can we do to gain or to improve or to build trust in those systems in such use cases. And I do not want to go into detail. The most important is that for the medical professionals, it's often that they need some sort of a rationale and not the black box system. So they say, if it's much easier for me to trust the system if I know why it decided this or that way. And on the other hand, for the patients, the information or the training, how to interact, what to say, what not to say, And there's some sort of angst before the machine or against this machine, how to deal with this. So bottom line for this slide is that it works, and if you want to implement it, we have to think about how to implement it and how to treat and how to train personnel and patients using it. Okay, now I want to leave triage and go to the second aspect that I have pointed in emergency department, and this is decision support systems or decision-assisted systems. And if you think about emergency care and in an ED, traditional chest X-rays is one of the standard procedures. And these are images. And this study is now more than 10 years old. So this is just to show that image recognition, identification, and classification via AI works quite well and is already implemented in a lot of radiology programs already. And what happened between 2015 and now is that this is a chest X-ray, two-dimensional image, that the importance of newer cross-sectional imaging data, of three-dimensional data is much higher, that we do have, even in the emergency department, often computer tomography systems. So we do have CT data. And this is what we see here. What we see is these three pictures. The left is an angiography where we see the vessel that supports the heart muscle with blood. And there is an obstruction or which might have led in this patient to myocardial infarction or myocardial injury. And in the middle, this is one slice of a three-dimensional data set of a CT scan. And on the right side, this is 3D reconstruction. And that if you're using imaging-based methods, that we are now also able to adequately and robustly identify diagnosis, in this case here, stenosis in coronary vessels via AI in three-dimensional or cross-sectional image data. And these are the result data. So perfect diagnosis would be a knee. So the green graph is quite good. And this is the commercially available AI system. And this is on a per patient level. So on a per patient level, and we have two different levels of experience in cardiologists. This is level 2 and level 3 reader. So if you go on per patient level, this commercially available system outperforms the expert human even. If you go on per vessel level, it's comparable. So blue and green are quite comparable between expert reader and system. But this also shows that having those systems would allow us to do much faster and much more diagnosis in settings where experts might not be available. And a second step is that we often have one image and look for one diagnosis. And as a human, we have a stepwise approach. So we first look for aspect 1 or concentrate or focus on a specific region. And this is also some development that we saw regarding technology in image recognition, that this is a study that uses a multi-stage approach. So that technology completely automatized does first a segmentation, where do we want to look, then looks for specific diagnosis with one model, and then for maybe smaller changes with another model. And that if we use more complex and more adapted approaches like this, that we even in these complex settings are able to gain really good diagnostic information out of the systems. And now I have talked a lot on trust already. And this is, I said, that black box is often a problem as a clinician or as a medical doctor. And especially if you think about image and image-based AI, that XAI or explainable AI is something that where a lot of work has gone in, and there are a lot of options for visualizing what a model does. This is a paper that uses GradCam versus Lyme as models, and then it's identification via CT scans of pneumonia in acute, semi-acute setting. They first used the model to do the diagnostics. And then they surveyed the medical doctors on the XAI. And this is a rather small survey, but I think it's really interesting that it shows where we have to go. It shows that the need for understanding AI decisions is something, so green is important, red is unimportant on this slide. So the most medical doctors say they want to understand why. Second, are they aware of XAI methods? Yes is unfortunately the red bar. So this is something where we have to work on, that this is really or might be helpful. And in this study, they then showed the GradCam, for example, and asked if the confidence and accuracy improved. And confident, or are they now confident? Red is confident, dark blue very confident, yellow not confident. So it seems that it does work, that it helps to improve confidence in this. And on the last...
Ganz vergessen, dass ich noch Joghurt habe. Habe ich gesehen. Ja, nicht viel. Also, Müsli holt man dann trotzdem irgendwann ins Frühstück, aber das ist jetzt alles nicht so. Und dann wollte ich jetzt nur noch ein letztes nochmal sagen dazu.
I'm sorry, but we cannot hear you.
Yeah, can you switch? Can you switch on the microphone?
and the heart cycle. So we have different leads that help us to pinpoint regarding location things. So this is a method that provides a lot of information and is still standard method in identification of acute myocardial infarction, myocardial ischemia, and arrhythmias. And it might also have some more information in it. And it's an old method. So this is, and I really like these old pictures as it shows the development of biomarker signals. And this is the first presentation of an ECG with physiologist with this dog, just to show the cardiac activity within one lead system. More important, and this is now more than 120 years ago, this is Eindhoven, where he had 3 different electrodes and defined specific combinations, dipoles of these to have a clearly defined representation in the dimensional space of the ECG. And this was further developed. These are the Wilson precordial leads. And this is, I think, the beginning, 1930s, that the ECG actually became the standard diagnostic tool in cardiovascular care. And if you look then on, for example, PubMed, this is the number of publications per year, starting in 1924. And what we see is that beginning mid of last century, that we got a strong increase in publications on the ECG. But later, echocardiography is imaging, and in the middle are the 2 lab biomarkers in cardiology. So we see that they became quite famous in the late years of the last century, and there was a decline in the ECG use. So the importance of the ECG went down. And I want to show you this, as I believe that like ischemia is something that is easily to detect, but we have maybe other more sensitive methods. But the ECG provides a lot more information that we normally think about, and that there technology and AI might help us to actually use this information in the ECG. And again, so this is the Nature Medicine publication from 2019 that shows that like arrhythmia identification in the ECG, this is in CNN that they used, that it's on the level of a cardiologist. So par to expert level. Still, this is 6 years now. This is a current publication that goes for ischemia detection, but it goes for those that have an obstructed or occluded vessel without ST elevation, what is the traditional sign. So these are patients that we do want to identify early. It's hard for a medical reader or a human reader to identify those, and that in those clinical need cases, but complex situations, we do see that a modern AI system outperforms experts. So this is really one step forward. So it's not only bringing expert knowledge in the broad range, but in some cases, in more complex cases, it might even outperform, whatever this means. So I already said that, okay, it's not only rhythm disorders and myocardial ischemia. So the heart is a pump. So all hemodynamic changes also affect the heart. And if you think about, this is a picture on the left is the healthy one, on the right, the diseased one of the aortic valve. This is the valve that separates the left ventricle, the heart, from the outflow tract. So if we see changes there, like calcification with the stenosis, then the heart has to work against this stenosis and changes accordingly. For example, stronger muscle, hypertrophy, enlargement, and so on. And these are all things that might also be seen in an ECG, where as a medical doctor, it's really hard to pinpoint, okay, this patient, based on ECG, has an aortic stenosis. Still, there are changes there. And this is something where AI technology might help. So this is already 5 years old, but it's the study that uses different ML methods to identify aortic stenosis based on ECG only. And it works quite well. So if you think about, and again, this patient level information, so we now have technology that does not need complex heart centers, but that is available based on only ECG data. So regarding early identification, prevention, this is really an immense chance. And just that ECG is a really good example for that it's easy to visualize context of XAI, what is actually highlighted areas, how to show or visualize to the medical doctor why the model decided this is an aortic stenosis patient or not. Now I've talked on rhythm disorders, myocardial ischemia, now a little bit on valve diseases. These are all common diseases, so we do see them often. So like myocardial infarction, as a cardiologist, we have seen hundreds of myocardial infarction ECGs. This is expert knowledge that is quite broadly available. But there are also other diseases that are not so common. And in those where you would need specific centers that have the expertise, these are settings where technology might help to bring these specific expertise in a broad range. And this is amyloidosis, which is a disease of accumulation of wrongly developed proteins that also can affect the heart, which is something that we do not see that often actually. And also in this case, AI is able to identify those patients that have a cardiac part in their amyloidosis. So this is a chance, but it's also a problem, as if we as experts only see seldomly ECGs of these rare cases, then it's hard to build up a data set for training. that has thousands of ECGs of cases. So this is also a limitation on how to bring or to develop these models. And this is a current development. So if you look on AI in imaging, and I think that in my, as a medical doctor, opinion, that having pre-trained models brought a huge step forward in development of imaging AI models. And that this is a development that we also do now see in ECG. So there are now foundation ECG models based on the timeline data of the multi-lead ECGs. This is one model that was recently published. Actually, it's still preprint. It's based on 9 million ECGs. So this might help to easier adapt to small case settings, to specific cohorts, to rare diseases. So I think this is a step that we soon will see, that it will be much easier to adapt the technology to our specific use cases. And in this paper, this is just comparison with another model that it shows that itself, in theoretically or artificial data, it works. This is now the start to the last part of my talk. I want to switch lanes a little bit. Up to now, all was from the perspective of medical care. And I want to go a little bit into medical research. And I'm a medical doctor and not a biologist or biochemist. So I want to talk about like clinical trials. So if we do have new drugs, new treatment options, then we do test these in large clinical trials. We define them, we define the groups, we define what are the outcome variables and see if it actually works, if it's on par with an established therapy or it's superior or inferior. So this is daily work, how modern medicine is based on such evidence. Just to mention that development of new drugs is a field where AI might also help, but this is not my field. So what we have here is, if you think about clinical trials, we have the best data sets we can get in medicine. So they are clearly defined. The data is obtained via SOPs. This is the best we can get. And this is one study that just used data of a large trial, the Fourier trial with 13,000 individuals. This is for risk stratification. So in this case, this is about 400 variables that they used to identify risk or to define high and low risk groups. And what they did is they used classic epidemiologic statistics, what is given here as the Cox or linear combination, and compared this to machine learning aspects like random forest or gradient boosting. And what they see is that if you use the same data, that you will be able to better discriminate. So if you look on the right side, the low risk and the high risk are closer together for the traditional model and much larger apart. So this better discriminates. So this just shows that if we have methods of machine learning with good data sets, we just might improve our results or can better interpret them. So this is more the context if I know what I want to know, so like supervised. And the second step is that also study data, that we can use technologies like clustering for an unsupervised approach. And this is a study that used the treatment with a drug beta blocker in heart failure patients with sinus rhythm and with atrial fibrillation. And the effect was not that good, actually, especially in the atrial fibrillation group. And they used the clustering, and they defined these 6 clusters in the AFib group. And the interesting is that they found one cluster of those, these patients benefited from the therapy of interest in the study. So this is just not that within the planning of the study that we just use another method like XGBoost versus Cox, but this is that we will be able to generate new data that we would not have expected. And this is based on clinical studies data, and it just shows that it might work and that it might help to like personalized medicine, to better identify specific cases for this therapy. And this was study data. And the next step is using real-world data. Real-world data is from the data quality aspect, from the amount of missing values, from the amount of non-curated, wrong entered values, much poorer from the data quality, and also regarding bias and representativity, but it's available. And it's available in huge numbers, and it better represents real world than if we plan a study for a specific question. And this is a study or a project that uses data from general practitioner registries, in the UK in this case. They used more than 600 variables out of this real-world clinical data. And actually, they did something comparable to the last trial. So they clustered those regarding heart failure and different potential types of heart failure. And they do have information on these are different outcomes. So if this patient is clustered and has heart failure and is in a cluster like, these are the clusters, so like late onset or like metabolic, then we can define based on this ML-based cluster a potential risk. And this risk is different for different endpoints. So we have groups that have a high risk for developing a myocardial infarction or developing peripheral vascular disease. So this helps us to better, just based on routine data that is available, to identify patients that have a risk for specific things and initiate respective treatments. And this is more what I can use with it, what I do with it. And the next step is, does it also help us understanding? And what they used is the UK Biobank, which is biomaterial representative, extremely well obtained in the UK, where we have genetic data and biomaterial and phenotype data. And they use these 5 groups or clusters they defined and looked for specific genetic changes. And actually they found, especially for the fibrillation type, some SNPs, some gene aspects that are associated with this. So it does not only help us to cluster patients to identify potential treatment strategies, but it might also help us to identify reasons for being in this cluster. And these might help to further develop new drug targets or treatments. And what they then did is then back to a clinical routine. They developed an online web score where you can enter a shortened version with 22 variables and see the patient that actually sits in front of you, which cluster he is. So that this is data that can go back to actual clinical use. And, this was my last actual slide. So I think that medical treatment or medical care has a vast spectrum of use cases, of requirements, and that not one fits all. So large language models can do a lot, but still they might not fit for all use cases. So that I think that if we think about technology, digitalization, artificial intelligence, and machine learning use, then we have to think about specific use cases. And if I remember the study where they implemented it in the emergency department, just having good technology might sometimes not be the way forward, but we have to think about, okay, who and why would it benefit from such technology improvements? And now I already said most of the second steps, so that this is not only interesting from a scientific standpoint, but also that it's just can be an AD, and that technology can help also for the human medical professionals to, let's say, focus again on the patient rather than the documentation. So this is really a point where we hope that we can use earlier and faster those technologies in the clinic. And finally, that in research and in clinical research, that we might have new opportunities, that we might see things that we have not anticipated on the one hand, and that on the other hand, that things that we plan, we might have a better efficiency and better results actually based on better models. And therefore, I want to thank you.